Hello, and welcome to ExultX Audio Articles podcast. Today, we have an exciting session focusing on training principles and load management in tactical populations. The core of today's discussion will be on how the right training stimulus can enhance physical performance while minimizing injury risks. We'll explore the physiological changes that occur in response to training and how they can be optimized. But first, we need to understand a training session as an organism stressor. What I mean is every time I do a training session, I am stressing specific parts of my organism. As such, it will react in different ways depending on the type of stress stimulus. So, the primary goal of any training program is to provide the right stimulus to enhance specific physical qualities, optimizing performance while reducing injury risk. This is particularly crucial for tactical populations because they don't have sports seasons. They may have planned deployments, which can help provide a timeline, but in most cases, they will try to predict periods that will be more demanding based on past data. Nevertheless, they still need to maintain high readiness or performance levels during the rest of the time. The concept of performance enhancement is grounded in the principles of training load and adaptation. Training, as a stressor, induces various physiological changes affecting neuromuscular, cardiovascular, metabolic, hormonal, and cellular functions. These changes depend on the volume, intensity, frequency, density, type of training, and other variables that an individual undergoes. The more effectively we manage these variables, the more significant the physiological adaptations. So every time we stress our organism, it represents a given load or training load. This load can be categorized into internal and external. For better understanding, you can think of internal load as measures of the physiological response during training, like heart rate, while external load refers to the total work performed, such as distance covered. Given that you already understand, we can have two completely different internal loads within the same external load. For example, in one session, you run 10K at an average heart rate of 145 BPM. In another session, you run exactly the same 10K at an average heart rate of 177 BPM. In these two sessions, your external load was the same, 10K. However, the internal load was completely different. This means that the physiological responses and adaptations will be different. But how do we adapt to training? To understand training adaptation, we need to grasp the concept of supercompensation. This concept was introduced in 1941 by Folbrot and involves a cycle with catabolic and anabolic phases, split into 4 subphases: fatigue, compensation, supercompensation, and involution. So let's do an exercise. Imagine that your performance can be represented by a line. If you are fully capable of your abilities with no fatigue, your performance line will be straight and represent your baseline. This means that your organism is stable. We call this the homeostasis state. In this state, you have your full capabilities available, of course, considering your performance. What I mean is, there is an absence of fatigue and any restraints that could restrict your performance. After each training session, your performance line drops due to acute fatigue. This is what Folbrot called the fatigue subphase. However, if you have all the adequate conditions to recover, including sleep, nutrition, hydration, rest, and so on, your organism will recover, and your performance line will rise to reach the baseline again. This subphase is called compensation. But our body is very efficient and adaptable, and the perception your organism has is that the initial baseline was not sufficient for this stress event. So it starts to build a new baseline to make the drop in performance less intense. In other words, this means your performance line will rise above the initial baseline. Think of it as if your baseline was 0. Now your performance line is at 0.1. This rise above the initial baseline represents the supercompensation subphase. But what happens then? Well, as I said, our bodies are very efficient and adaptable. If they never face a similar stress event again, they will go back to the former baseline. This is known as the involution subphase. Naturally, this is an attempt to explain a complex process in a very simple way. But if you understand the principle of supercompensation, you understand why we need to train regularly to promote performance growth, or simply to maintain performance. Another important concept was proposed by an endocrinologist named Hans Selye. He proposed the general adaptation syndrome and set the basis for understanding overtraining. Like Fulbrot, he describes the body's response to stress, but in only 3 phases: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Getting back to our exercise of the performance line, after a training session, the line drops due to acute fatigue, as we have seen, and Hans calls this the alarm phase. If you have all the conditions to recover, your performance line will rise, which Hans calls the resistance phase. But what happens if we don't have all the adequate conditions to rest? What happens if your organism is still in a drop phase and you do another training session? Well, that's what Hans called the exhaustion phase. The exhaustion phase is when our organism doesn't have the conditions to recover, and the performance line just keeps dropping, increasing the risk of overtraining and injuries. In sum, proper training management ensures progression through the alarm and resistance phases, avoiding the detrimental exhaustion phase. We know during the alarm phase, athletes may experience soreness and temporary performance decline. In the resistance phase, the body adapts, enhancing performance, but prolonged stress or poor recovery can lead to the exhaustion phase. That leads to another question. How can I understand if I have enough rest? Effective training load management involves systematic variation of training variables, such as, but not limited to, intensity and volume. There are various tools to help monitor fatigue, such as GPS, heart rate variability, velocity-based training, training impulses, known as TRIMP, lactate measurements, and wellness questionnaires. These tools can help monitor training loads effectively. However, depending on the tactical setting, some of these tools might not be available. In their absence, we can use a less expensive yet highly effective system, the Rate of Perceived Exertion Scale, or RPE scale. The RPE scale measures perceived effort, and despite the many adaptations of the original scale, the most common is the 0 to 10 scale, where 0 represents a complete lack of effort, like resting in bed, while 10 represents the most strenuous effort you have ever experienced. The use of the RPE scale requires a prior explanation of what it is and what it represents. It should also be used in daily training sessions to help operators adapt to and learn the scale. I strongly recommend showing the RPE scale every time you ask for it, even when the operators already have it memorized, and try to ask always at the same phase of the session. For example, at the end of the session, have a tablet available where each operator can insert their RPE. In this way, you create training routines that lead to the accuracy of the RPE values. When the operators classify their training session using this scale, we can also understand the internal load that the session represents. The most common way is by multiplying it by the session duration. This leads to the session RPE, or SRPE. This distinction is important because a session lasting 30 minutes classified as a 7 is completely different from a session lasting 2 hours classified as a 7. If someone is collecting RPE, it is important to consider who that person is. In some situations, it could be favorable for the accuracy of the values if the person collecting RPE is not part of the chain of command or the tactical fitness instructor team. For example, during courses, if a tactical fitness instructor asks an operator for their RPE at the end of a foot march, the operator, afraid of being evaluated, might provide false RPE scores. Consequently, This would result in a false assessment of the operator's internal load. Another useful metric is the acute and chronic workload ratio. This ratio compares recent training loads to long-term averages, helping to balance workload and reduce injury risk. If you use the SRPE scale, you have the workload of each training session, so you can calculate the acute and chronic ratio. This metric is very useful because we know that a higher chronic load represents a lower injury risk. Additionally, it helps us understand how our workload evolves over time. It is important to note that the guidelines for injury risk mitigation suggest that weekly workload growth should not exceed 10%. Of course, we know that this value is an indication, and there will be weeks when we surpass it. However, if you consistently exceed this 10% by a significant margin for 2, 3, or 4 weeks, you need to be aware that the risk of injury is higher, so you should monitor your operator's fatigue very carefully. There are several other monitoring tools, like the monotony index and strain index, that could also play vital roles. While the monotony index assesses daily training variability, the strain index measures cumulative training load, and both are critical for managing fatigue and preventing injuries. In a tactical context, operators perform various physically demanding tasks that contribute to their overall training load, which are not part of the physical training sessions. These tasks range from day-to-day activities to tactical specific training and could include restraining individuals, crowd control, load carrying, and so on. Monitoring and managing these loads and integrating them with physical training loads is essential to ensure readiness and prevent injuries. Nevertheless, a systematic approach to physical training, similar to traditional athletes, is crucial in tactical contexts. Periodization, which structures training to balance work and recovery, can enhance performance and reduce injury risks. This doesn't mean we need to have sports seasons or peak forms, but it means having a program that considers all the variables of training periodization, as well as rest and load balance. Of course, in tactical physical training and preparation, we need to be much more adaptable than in a sports context. But not having a training program, structure, or periodization is simply negligent regarding the readiness status, well-being, long-term development, and health of our operators. Just as in tactical operations, where it is common to say that planning is often the first loss, in tactical physical training, the program or periodization is often the first to go. However, with a well-designed structure, we can readapt the training sessions according to short and long-term goals. By applying these principles, we will maximize readiness and performance as much as possible, given the context constraints, while managing injury risk through balanced workloads and systematic training variations. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this episode interesting, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more deep dives into the world of tactical populations. You can also read this information in detail in our written article on our website, ExultX.com, along with other content. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Until then, stay fit, stay strong, and stay ready.